Good evening, everyone. Hopefully my voice is coming through loud and clear today. We are having another mix and mash battle lounge today with the 2MK team. Our mix and mash style means that you will not be able to join any lounges based on precisely what we have, but should be able to find us as a generality wandering around, and we might tell you where we are on stream in case you can't tell from the number of people in the lounge. It might be too large, etc. So we are today looking at what changes we've managed to make over the last couple of weeks of execution and tactics training, mostly with each other. We tend to rotate between the two over time. So we're definitely hoping that today is showing that we've managed to make progress in specific ways, while helping us gain new information on other progress that needs to be made. We would say normally that this is a US East Coast lobby, or give you methods to look for it, but we don't technically know all the time who the lobby host is, only that our stream station, or sometimes whoever else is joining that lounge, has a good connection to the lounge leader, which might not be representative of your experience at all. Since so much of what we've been training recently are technically relatively minor changes and advances, we're not necessarily going to have a lot to talk about in moment-to-moment interactions, but tactics do come up, especially when you are facing characters who don't necessarily have too much advantage over your own. Even matchups are getting closer to the order of the day in this game, and in those cases where people don't consider the matchup itself even, they definitely have a way to play through it. They just expect that they're at enough of a disadvantage that they have to play a little more solidly, a little better. And sometimes that's what you want. You don't really need to say, well, I must be advantaged in every fight, especially if you're not sure that your opponent is that much stronger than you as a player. You might be able to relatively easily get yourself through some situations that otherwise would seem dangerous or difficult. This is somewhat what we tend to expect from the Rashid matchup for Karim, specifically our Karim. Because while Rashid is not the easiest character to pin down, Karim can fight Rashid without having to do that for a relatively long period if she's patient enough. The stressor, therefore, being holding that patience. He's not terribly easy to whiff punish, but he is relatively easy to bait into doing things. Case in point, sorta. Because the character commits as much as he does to nearly everything. You just have to know how to get out of his more specific higher level mix-ups, which not every player has mastered to the point where you have to worry about them. But here we have the moment of patience required. Kazuki Dynasty did lose it a little bit, but managed to hold it back in time to take that particular round. So you'll definitely be seeing different people today, you'll definitely be seeing different matchups than usual today. And we will do our best to try to rotate around some different spaces. But as that particular lounge has either disbanded or rejected presence, it's time to meet, let's see. We won't be joining Adequate Kyle because Adequate Kyle appears to be more than adequate for this moment. So we might actually wait a little bit to see whether or not we can find the lounges of our other team members. Those lounges are normally created with our usual setups, but with simply less slots. So you might see character select off, and we can use that sometimes to zero in on them. But because the game still has some system that we're not fully understanding about whether or not you can, in fact, find the lounges of people, matchmaking servers or something, it's not always possible even when they're probably one of the few with that particular setup. Normally as well, it's required that you change it from time of creation in terms of display order to similar league standing, especially if you happen to be similar to our league standing. And there's multiple lounges, multiple levels of skill among the team that you probably should find someone, again, assuming that it's even working. But for now, it looks like we might get a familiar matchup while we wait for other people to join the Wolf's Lounge. It's not entirely familiar, as the Wolf is still getting used to playing Necalli in this situation and in this matchup, and Kansuki Dynasty, while she's more familiar with Necalli as a character and opponent, is still working out some of the finer details of how she wishes to approach the matchup, particularly against someone as relatively instinctive and creative as the Wolf tends to be. It tends to be a lot more about finding punishes and making sure that she's ready to get damage when she gets the opponent opened up, which sounds like what you'd normally be doing at this level overall, but it can definitely go the other way when a player has good enough defense that you're trying to overwhelm them with stress and pressure. Players who play too naturally or instinctively are much harder to overcome in this way. Or maybe it's just that it can feel that way sometimes because they'll uppercut out of strings without you knowing why. And not understanding why your opponent uses certain defenses is absolutely meaningful in a game where sometimes you do choose to or have to go for pressure. Going for pressure is one of the better ways to stress your opponent enough to get them to slow down, to get them to do what you want. But if they generally break out of this pressure or are hard to discourage from doing certain things, you're not so well going to build up that state in them, that moment where they've decided, okay, I should hang back here, when you could jump in for the empty jump low, empty jump throw, dash up in certain situations, and so on. Most people will react to dashes because they trained a different way or are being relatively aggressive on the ground, but jumps are a little bit harder because of this. And it tends to overwhelm footsie players once they get stressed. It is in fact why players who play a lot of footsies often need to spend so much time practicing anti-airs, and players who spend a lot of time improving their own pressure, oddly, tend to need to learn to calm down when they are being pressured themselves. It's often mindset related as a totality, but if you don't fit into either one of those categories, you're generally instinctive enough as a player that your opponent has to try to find their way through your instincts with their raw physical skill. Can I punish this? Can I push on this? And so on. Necalli is, however, not a terribly difficult character to whiff punish, despite some of his better normals in neutral being basically moves you shouldn't be trying to whiff punish. Anything else he uses that isn't fundamentally defensive is telegraphed, and telegraphed options tend to make it much easier to decide to try to set up the whiff punish rather than just reacting to it because buttons are happening. For Karine, this can be a little bit hard, as she is a character that often manages to do things like Seppo and Tenko as whiff punishes in themselves. But Necalli doesn't really give a lot of space for that timing-wise. However, that sort of setup is a bit more effective. To set your expectations, the stream will probably either be going quieter later on, depending on the matchups we end up seeing, or the side will switch entirely to probably just fine talking. Our plan is definitely to only have one match of this type at a time though, so we're going to go wait and see whether or not the Wolf will get opponents on that side, but we're leaving this lounge to go search for another one. Sometimes our own players will go around searching for lounges. That of course makes them more difficult to find and join. But we may still be able to let you know, especially if we end up entering that lounge ourselves. We won't necessarily attempt to join Adequate Cal, mostly because they have a very specific request as to how strong their opponent should be. And we actually know from various interactions that the thing that we generally consider gold level of play is not something that Kansuku Dynasty can keep up for very long just yet, as it has a lot to do with mindsets and patience, and she's still working on that whenever she can. While this time of creation setting will probably still manage to keep working for a while longer, please note that as we go further and further into the stream, time of creation is going to become less and less of an option, and so we're going to use similarly standing once again, just to see if it causes anyone different to come up. This mostly has to do with the density of players on the server at the time, if you're not familiar with it, but it definitely comes up long term. one more check, and we'll try actually joining one of the lesser connections, because while we are not terribly fond of playing in lag, you'd be surprised that lately 3 bars does not necessarily mean there will be levels of lag that mid-level players care about. That said, please don't try to join things that people don't want you in. They'll make it clear pretty fast though. Still, with both of these players in that range, I think we can safely assume that they are not geographically nearby. We'll still have a watch of their match though, and if they want to play, they'll probably confirm, and if they don't, we'll just get booted out right after, which is generally fine given that there was no one else to play against at the moment, and we do like watching matches on this stream fairly often. As it does help us discuss things such as Gil versus Rashid. We've occasionally seen the high-level version of this matchup, as in the team, that is, at the Buffalo FGC Fight Night, and basic analysis of that indicates that while Gil can absolutely fight Rashid, it's relatively hard to make use of zoning. Oh no, I didn't pick Rashid after all, which is worse because technically Gil does not fight Ed well either. The primary reason for this is actually that Ed's back dash is too good. While Ed cannot easily punish Gil, Ed often doesn't need to. He can just dance around and not do particularly much of anything. This means that Gil often must play relatively aggressively, as you're sort of seeing here already, and doesn't get to play much zoning. Ed using V skill 2 makes this even harder, though this player seems to be using it relatively aggressively instead, which is a little easier for Gil to deal with as a whole, because he just blocks mostly. Ed also has the advantage just shown of relatively large reach on his uppercut, meaning it's much more useful as a way of getting through various forms of Gil zoning. Not to mention that, with this level of counters, Gil's largest advantage is managing to bait anything from Ed that will lead to huge damage. It's difficult to play a perfect game against Ed, basically. But you can definitely get enough meter, enough advantage to put a lot of damage on the table and win the match that way. Still, it's sort of an execution test. You're really relying on your ability to do those long Gil combos, while Ed is mostly just going to outmaneuver you for a lot of the match. One good thing that does help is the fact that actually Ed's uppercut, particularly his EX uppercut, has a very strange, small failure in its hitboxes. It's just slightly incapable of hitting something directly above Ed in certain situations. In fact, this is generally a weakness of many of Ed's attacks. If you could manage to somehow get on top of Ed's head in terms of distance, he has a bit more trouble landing a hit there than most characters. This is particularly helpful if the move you are doing is bringing you down at the time, rather than things like instant overheads, which involve you going up into the air, and while you do get the hit, Ed can often recover in time. This is particularly useful for Bison and Gil because they have moves that are both variable in their distance and can be timed and placed directly above Ed's head. So a move that is normally a relatively bad idea in most matchups, specifically Gil's Moonsault, actually becomes relatively helpful here, even in pressure. Difficulty being, again, it's sort of execution testy, and Ed can absolutely backdash more when they expect this move to be coming and still punish it. That said, a lot of Ed's good punishes for this move, especially if you have Ed closer to the corner, use up meter and don't get Ed very much. Still, you can take a couple of chances with it. Gil is not known for his skill in fighting various boxers. That's a Dudley reference, sort of, but not really. So it might be inexperience that Enrico has here, or it might just be not being interested or willing in using that specific tactic. After all, it can be hard sometimes if you've been taught that a move is bad or shouldn't be used in most matchups to remember, oh wait, this is the one matchup I'm supposed to use that move in, right? Oof. Outright frozen, huh? Aha! The Battle Lounge host has changed. Well, as this is 3 bars, we're not necessarily going to expect them to be too enthusiastic about this. But I guess we could try confirming and see what they say. Or don't say, relatively. Already had one Rashid match, might have another, but the character select is on, so there's no way to know. Looks like they're at least willing to give it a try though, so... will we in fact get Rashid? We've discussed the Ed matchup somewhat recently, but even I don't always keep every part of them in my head. There is some thing to be said for writing notes. And for some reason I find the Karin versus Ed matchup to be difficult to remember, possibly because I tend to remember it from the Ed side. There's also the factor that often comes up where we have to decide which type of Ed it is. You've probably heard me say this many times if you've watched previous streams, but Ed generally comes in 2 forms. I am really good at footsies, and I am playing footsies never. So let's see which type of Ed we have, given that Gil really doesn't tell you what the Ed you're facing is like. Well, they appear to be willing to hit footsie buttons. And I can definitely say we're seeing more of the specific intent in that space, along with the good jump timing. So we're going to count for now that this is an Ed that is capable of playing footsies and therefore will actually be a challenge for Kansuki Dynasty in that she's not used to fighting that type of Ed. You generally have to get up to gold or higher in terms of Ed players, or even just people who are willing to play Ed as a generality, before you find people who will just deal with their problems by hitting footsie buttons and taking advantage of all those really good spacings that Ed tends to end up at, that you don't really notice as much when you haven't gotten that level of skill yet. Karin often makes use of her bat dash in these spaces, but not necessarily because it's going to lead to Ed getting hurt, per se. It's simply because resetting to that form of the neutral is where she has better advantage. It's similar to the Akuma matchup. You don't really want your opponent to use their pushback to control you, and then you be forced to respond under their terms. Let's see if they're willing to rematch. Was it laggy or not? Didn't seem laggy from this side, but you never know. We do see a lot less of the one-sided lag now as far as I'm understanding about the game. And when you see it, you know it's really bad. But it's generally now that it's just bad, period, when it's bad. But yes, this important point of making sure that when you are suffering from pushback, that the character is not the type of character where you being in their pushback loop means that you basically can't win footsies. You backdash out of certain situations, especially if you feel, okay, the opponent made a move to get in. I was unable to respond to this move and therefore had to block. And now they've started hitting more buttons. When this is the thing that's happening, you're usually going to lose simply because the other player has learned which buttons to press against your character that tends to just win. This pushes on Kansuki Dynasty's instincts a lot because Kirine normally wins in that situation, making her footsies better than most characters. Even when you have put Kirine in pushback, most characters in this game don't flatly win against her buttons. It's basically just Akuma, Chun-Li, and Ed. Other characters tend to have buttons that are either too slow, push back sequences that are not helpful for the purpose, or have to worry too much about Kirine's damage conversions to work it out. Ed's ability to move so quickly also puts a lot of strain on the character up against him for other reasons, and he can cross the screen more easily, making your own advances more difficult. But as we noted before, it's precisely because of things like this that we generally don't join gold level lounges. We generally don't assume that Kansuki Dynasty is going to be gold playing tier at any given time. It's remembering all of the little bits that really matter, and pushing past your own instincts to draw out whatever skills you need for the purpose. But this player is willing to give that another try, maybe not with Ed, but hopefully they will. Still, no matter what character they play, we get to have that interaction today, it looks like. That note of, well, this is what gold looks like, this is what I'm pushing for. And to see various characters at basically, let's not say exactly that level of play, you don't generally know. Players in this game often stop at gold while building up much higher skill sets. Because for some people, ranked is just pain. For some characters, it's particularly stressful. And while I'm not saying it is specific to that, this person does have an LP amount in that range where you could assume that maybe you aren't actually trying to do that way. Ryu can actually be played like this in a lot of ways, but Ryu relies more on the fireball, and the fireball is at least punishable. Ryu benefits from getting better combos on the jumps than Ed does. But you can already see, playing with just the standing fierce punch and similar things, you could have a very similar outcome as a whole. That said, against Ryu one doesn't generally need to do the backdash part. Kirine can in fact just challenge at the end of lot strings, and it forces Ryu to generally be more inventive. Fortunately, Ryu does have quite a few good strings that lead to him having advantage, though he doesn't necessarily get a lot of damage from them. This is why Season 1 Ryu was generally considered relatively stronger, because he hit functionally much harder and got to save a lot more meter for big finishes. You can in fact play Ryu that way still now, as if you are good enough in footsies, you don't really need EX Fireball for much, and you don't get knocked down enough to need to use your ES uppercut.
You win.
But we probably should treat this as more so the thing that was holding her back before doesn't apply to Ryu.
Fight.
That said, players can learn pushback sequences, learn interactions where this does still work. And you always have to watch out for that. When you've not met a pushback interaction before, if you want to learn more about these, generally the person in the high level scene who will most succinctly teach it is Smug. So if you can find Smug streams, there's some additional information and you can just poke Smug about it, like when practicing, and maybe he'll do something for you. So far we haven't found anyone else who can generally explain it as easily while doing it. But maybe if you speak Japanese, you also have some other sources.
Round 2. Fight.
This is not to say there aren't other people, because obviously no one has time to watch that many streams, but it's the one we can recommend now. And in fact, we can basically say that that's what we're seeing now. The skill set of this player tends to lead to that. They've spent more time, or just through experience, learned more button to hit that you will block, followed by button that they can hit to beat what follows. Simply blocking against this sort of player won't necessarily get you much further, because usually they've learned exactly how to push back on the second hit too. They might not get any advantage out of it, but you probably aren't going to be counterattacking them. It usually results in a reset to neutral or a fireball. Often a late confirmed fireball, and you still have to worry about the same things. There we go. The medium kick and heavy kick is a good one. Max range, or near max range technically, because at max range I think it doesn't work. The light kicks to be anything Karin sticks forward. There's a lot of that in this player's style. As well as specifically chosen retreats for when the situation is nowhere near that. Ooh, even after that. However, that adaptation comes more so from the core of being a Karin player. Karin is a character who actually deals with this situation a lot, her hitting advancing-ish buttons once out at a range like that, and being defeated by other players doing the neutral jump in those spaces. Since Ryu, unlike Ken, cannot really easily punish that same spot, more or less the same thing happens.
Let's do this.
Facing this opponent, therefore, as if they were a Karin player themselves, just playing different characters, might be closer to a winning strategy than most things. That said, this skill type doesn't necessarily come from the Karin mindset. As mentioned before, it is heavily based on an Ed sort of thing. Many characters can do it, but they tend to have less functional capability to keep it up. Ed doesn't have as much. Rashid is another good character for this, but Rashid is more easily defeated because of his relative lack of strong, quick chasing. Characters with slower backdashes will face the same problems against Rashid, but Karin generally doesn't. as she can treat it more like Ed, where she still needs to backdash, but has much less risk of being caught when she does.
I'll show you the divide in our class.
Round one. Fight.
Rashid therefore must make use of a lot of mobility options to make this work out, whereas Karin can mostly just walk around mid-screen. The calmer she is, the easier it is to deal with the wind as a whole, and she can use various options such as Seppo to move around when Rashid isn't all that committed to anything, especially longer ones, because they'll either result in her being able to react to something by hitting the Tenko at basically the last moment, or not needing to because the Seppo will recover in time. Her general option against Rashid, though, doesn't really work as well here, specifically the heavy Mujin Kyaku intended to hit at maximum range. Because the player is moving a lot more, they won't tend to be in the same space, and they're not really trying to zone as much. Last minute Orochi helps as well, but it's a little bit harder to actually do against most things that Rashid cares about. And is really unhelpful against the trigger 2 because, in general, the way that the projectiles change during the V-Trigger 2 changes a lot of how this matchup flows. We just haven't seen Vegeta activate that part of the matchup yet. Since Rashid's accuracy as a character is actually relatively low, Karin can move around more freely. What she can't usually do is attack freely, because it's too easy for Rashid to catch her at the last moment. Characters that have long animations and can convert those animations into different attacks are not the sort of characters you want to attack too heavily against when they are in their mobility mode. Because their mobility mode is not undefended, it's not you get to move for free right now. This is something we often see in terms of Akuma, where Akuma is limited in mobility mode options when retreating and so on until V-Trigger 1 is active, in which case you have to worry about Air Fireball more.
Round one. Fight.
But unfortunately, since you can't just let down your guard in order to do counterattacks, and Karin generally doesn't have the same targeting space as most other characters, it's harder to do as a whole. So there is quite a lot of walking to do, which is again going to be rough for Kazuki Dynasty to do, as just walking for long periods is one of her weaknesses in the game. She either commits to it for too long, or doesn't commit to it enough and attacks earlier than she probably should. But this is, all as mentioned, just the thing that makes gold hard to achieve as a mindset. So she does get to work on just walking around. Fortunately for Karin, once her V-Trigger is active, a lot of Rashid's options for breaking her defense by delaying things become extremely reactable. Rashid is an evasive character, hard to pin down, particularly for Karin, who doesn't have a lot of moves that are quick in that regard. She can't just attack above her head. She can't instantly beat this specific space as easily as many other characters. Because of the way her hurt boxes work, she might have to worry about being hit out of them before it matters. The parry resolves basically all of this and allows her to just hit that button instead and defeat the opponent's options. But it looks like that run is over, so we are heading out. Still more work to do on the mental side, but we knew that going in. So let's look around once again at our options and find out indirectly from the team whether or not their statuses are different. But it looks like the primary option is again another basically gold player. There already are 2 people in there though, so we'll see what happens. Because these matches are just as much about searching for situations to make improvements and possibly review later, as they are about testing things one has already worked on.
Round 1. Fight! Round 2. Fight! Mika wins. It's go time.
Okay, looks like the
Let's do this.
Cammy has moved on. Without making any comments on their intention of that match. We saw Mika before. Character select is on. No way to know who we get this time until about now. The mirror match, as mentioned before. So we actually get to see the previously discussed thing in action very directly, and we already know that the player, just from watching that, does have a specific level of calm and focus for this purpose. I don't expect them to be rushing down or trying to get specific types of advantage, but we'll see. Maybe their Korean style is a bit more direct. Therefore, the problem I'm going to expect here is actually the tendency to not respond too well to pressure, because Karene's pressure is quite good, but Kazuki Dynasty's response to other Karene pressure is, since she knows what can beat it, she doesn't necessarily physically practice beating it. And our Karene bot is definitely not based on that. However, what I will expect to be the problem is, aside from that, the whole walking up situation. The thing one loses most against when it comes to Karene is not knowing how much to walk. Misunderstanding or misreading her intentions or ranges and getting poked by trying to get into your own optimal range. Or maybe choosing a rhythm that involves you moving at the wrong time and getting crush countered. This is why high-level play involving this character often has so much of this crush counter fishing, as people call it, within it. There's a lot of spaces where Karene's heavy kick beats a lot of things, and while you can absolutely whiff punish the move, you would have to stop short in situations where you were probably not thinking about that. Since the move takes relatively long to animate, you also have the potential to literally walk into it, because you didn't recognize that that's what was about to happen. And having very similar rhythms and just being higher level, in this case Super Gold, means that reading an opposing, less experienced Karene's tendencies to hit buttons is easier, which will lead to more of those crush counters. Karene does still beat Karene by neutral jumping the same way every other character beats Karene though, because it tends to open up spacings and movements that make things a little easier. The opponent doesn't have a really good target for the neutral jump at that spacing. She's always had this problem, and I don't think they plan to change anything about that. It can go away in specific ways, but you're generally not going to get too much out of it. You generally will get away with the neutral jump simply because even if you do get punished, she's often strained to do so, much more so than any other situation brings up. And straining the opponent in this way is always important.
Round one. Fight.
Forward jumps also don't help as much in this situation, whereas backdashes are likely to be more important, and the relatively difficult stand heavy kick whiff punish is also important. Stand heavy kick can generally be whiff punished by Karene's stand medium punch at a certain range. Interestingly, her crouching medium kick tends to whiff. We're not completely sure how this works or why. It probably has to do with the way that the hurt box is actually extended during the kick. But you can generally use the stand medium punch as the whiff punish, and if you're really focused enough, you can use medium Mujin, not necessarily because it will whiff punish easily in itself, but because the opponent will almost never manage to do anything about it afterward. Still, these are both relatively difficult things because I believe that the medium punch requires a micro step to do it in many places, and you have to be on point with that timing. In other words, you probably had to expect the stand heavy kick, which means you probably had to set up the situation where your opponent would hit it, and yet not automatically do something yourself. Rough practice, to say the least. This is particularly difficult when you find yourself in the corner because there's nowhere to walk back into, meaning that the heavy kick is much more likely to actually hit at max range than to possibly be evaded. Particularly because you will want to crouch block, and crouch blocking makes your hurt box larger and therefore makes the kick more likely to hit. At really high levels of play, you see a lot of small interactions where people move barely out of the way of an attack. just by standing up and maybe taking one step backward.
It's go time.
It's a rough life.
Let's do this.
We'll see if we get the Kareen mirror again, but I'm honestly not expecting it. And I'm not sure it would be specifically helpful. Our bot is actually coded to do most of this, but because of where we put the stand heavy kick in the matchup, and because you can't generally get bots other than Urian to set up footsie situations, you're not likely to see it. You more so have to train it based on the heavy kick itself, which would be super rare anyway. That said, it is in there. You can try to learn it, and you can tweak the bot very slightly, I think, to get the benefit from it. Seth is a little easier to deal with, because even at higher levels of Seth, Seth is a very... don't want to use the joke, but it's so correct. Seth is a very monotone character, meaning that generally higher skill doesn't translate into Seth playing differently just how much damage Seth does. So you can probably spend the whole matchup fighting about the same, i.e. in this case, spacing very perfectly and hitting either quick Tenkos or crouch heavy kick. Sweep. Kareen's sweep in particular is one of Seth's greatest weaknesses, because she gets to stand just outside a range where Seth is otherwise effective, and basically because one of Seth's footsie buttons is in fact not hittable, not going to hit crouching, just the act of trying to do it will put her in a better situation. Seth does have punishes for the move, but they're really specific and difficult enough in most spacings that you care. Good catch there though. And a bit of psychological warfare, let's say.
Round 2. Fight.
Seth is one of those characters that unfortunately doesn't benefit much from jumping at Kareen either, and is one of the few characters that doesn't benefit much from neutral jumping. It is still one of the better defenses you can use against Kareen's specific form of footsies, but because she is so likely to use the crouching heavy kick, which extends her so far but doesn't give her much of a hurt box to aim at in her standing position, and she just doesn't have a good reason to do most of her advancing move against Seth once she has that option, Seth tends to need to be able to lead Kareen into bad situations first, make her want to attack, and then find the neutral jump timing there.
You win.
Unfortunately, this doesn't really mean that much has changed here. The fact is that this is simply easier because Seth doesn't play that differently as you get better in terms of that. You can definitely get better at the target combos, but so far, in every match I've seen, high-level Seth and mid-level Seth look the same, with a lot of emphasis on one particular trick and mental state, how often you can bait people into doing uppercuts instead of waking up in other ways, and pressure, which in turn leads to damage. I'll of course keep on watching. I don't expect this is completely true because there should probably be some way to play Seth either more creatively or something I'm just missing. But this is often the result actually. We see much longer periods of defense, and it's not in any way a bad option. Proper defensive play from Seth is a good way to deal with a lot of characters, especially because V-Trigger does build up from blocking moves. You build up enough of it and lots of damage happens. Since Seth is a character who really doesn't have to worry about loss of the V-Trigger until one button is touched, land the correct thing with the V-Trigger active and great. while also having an invincible move as an option for getting out of situations without the reversal. That can generally wait until that moment comes and then do a lot of damage. With the bigger worry being forced to relatively low health while in that situation, because then maybe some throws will take you out and you'll have to really be stressed about it.
You lose.
More defensive play will, of course, push on our Karim players' tendencies and make this harder. But it's not in most ways an execution test or even a reaction test. It's just mental almost entirely. I need to do less of this because my opponent is defending more. And while that's no easier than the other two types, it doesn't necessarily indicate much change in the matchup. While one does need to practice mental shifts, the type of practice that it requires can sometimes be subverted just by being in the correct mental state to begin with. Unlike execution, where your mental state may help a little bit with your execution, but for the most part, once you have not gotten execution for some punish, you have to grind it. This sort of thing, if you are conscious enough, you could fix it basically by meditation.
Round 2. Fight.
So we'll watch this for a bit. Since I may be switching out soon, I do have news about bots, specifically that we potentially have a new Dhalsim bot, inspired by the fact that when Dhalsim was updated with that specific command normal, his down back medium kick, I should have realized that that gives me the option to use, for those who are interested in experimenting with bots, it gives you the option to use down back triple kick for a lot of Dhalsim stuff, and that unlocks an entirely new method of building Dhalsim bot. Not one that helps you with zoning or yoga fires, but we've long since learned that that's not necessary. We can use the CPU for both that and actual teleport shenanigans. What I'm speaking of is a better Dhalsim bot for the original purpose of Dhalsim bot. How do I manage to hit you out of the air without dying? We are seeing a little of the whiff punish requirement, but the way that the whiff punish requirement works on Seth is cleaner in terms of what Karim can actually do about it. Seth tends to commit much longer to moves, and while the punishes or whiff punishes themselves tend to be small, as in just medium kick, stand medium kick that is, often Seth can't do much about it. Seth does not recover in a way that will result in the medium kick not having to be blocked, as you just saw. In other words, even if you're late, you still hit the whiff punish and nothing happens to you. Well-timed Mad Cradle.
You lose.
With no other joiners, this might not keep up for too long, but we'll see what they do. Nope, they're willing to continue.
Let's do this.
There's a good chance you'll see lots of Clans of Dynasty today because as far as we're hearing, there's not a lot of fortune other people are having with their lounges. Nothing good solid that we're sticking in. And there are just less players around this week, which coincides with our mix and mash timing, more so than was intended because of it. Now here's a match that is sometimes played at the diamond level. And I don't think I could necessarily encompass everything that is known about it. However, it is played against a very specific style of Lara. Whether or not this player's Lara style will turn out to be similar, we'll have to watch and see. So far we're seeing similar things. The matchup isn't that static. You can definitely play Lara in more than one way against Karin, especially depending on which V-skill and V-trigger you use, more so V-trigger than V-skill, and how willing you are to take damage on trades. But at the core, Hanscadensi has a decent idea of how to defend against this character, and they both benefit from neutral jumping the other, so she'll get to stay in that mental state of, I'm neutral jumping now. The thing about Lara you always have to remember is, she is a very momentum-based character, and psychologically life leads aren't real. You have to spend a lot more time paying attention to how much damage Lara is capable of doing, not just how much she recently has. Similarly, Lara is in the same position. Because she is so capable of doing so much damage, it can often seem like she's got a good advantage, but normally this comes at a time where she has given the opponent a ton of resources, and if she makes any mistakes, they'll quickly capitalize on them to reverse the situation.
Round one. Fight.
And the counter to footsies. While we're not sure that we will have Dhalsim bot ready at that timing, there's still a lot of testing to do across many of our team members. We definitely expect to have something, and that will probably be on one of our Friday streams in the upcoming weeks. You can actually treat this as a full replacement, even though it is going to have mostly the same goal, because technically there are different ways of dealing with Dhalsim, and having the Yoga Fire available in the same space as the air movement matters for certain characters rather than others, so our current plan is to have it separated more so in that way. If you play certain characters, you care more about trying to use Dhalsim Bot 1, and other characters you care more about Dhalsim Bot probably 2.0. Defense held pretty well, but we are now moving on. As mentioned, the stream is either about to get quiet or involve Just Fine having things to say. But I really am off for the night. And the stream itself is likely to continue for probably another 40 minutes, maybe a little less. Lounges tend to stay open longer than that, but again, we have less players overall tonight, some of them coming in later, some otherwise. And now we have a moment to check, because we now have Chi versus our Urban Eddy various play. So we'll see what turns out that way, but as for now, I'm either handing you off or preparing you for a stream end that will probably be quiet, and the closeout will probably come from Kansuki Dynasty's side to let you know when the stream will be ending.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! G wins. Round one. Fight! do this.
I am the world's president.
Good evening, everyone. Long time no chat. This is Just Fine on the mic. So this is normally the season where we would end up training for tournaments and
Fight.
going to one or two. However, given the whole pandemic thing, we're still doing the same types of training, but obviously there's no great big tournament. However, there's always online locals, so if you have your own, check out to see if they have something online. Now that local shilling is out of the way, I am going to basically talk about my own training that I've been doing the past few days, and hoping that I get in some good matches.
Round two.
So the main thing that I've been prepping for is trying to get past the current wall that I'm at with Armika. She's probably one of my favorite characters of all time in fighting games to play. However, I definitely have some holes in my own way of playing. For starters, I still have a little bit of a problem with bravery, and with a character like Armika, bravering is non-optional.
You lose.
The other thing that I have been working on is just general reactions and keeping not necessarily calmer under pressure, but definitely trying to work out what exactly causes certain types of stress reactions and how to essentially get myself to have a bit more muscle memory for certain types of punishes and anti-air situations. So I've been going through the gambit of bots, doing a lot of the neutral awareness as well as anti-air practice that comes along with some of the more beginner and medium level bots. And honestly, just getting back in the swing of things with bots in general, since it's been a while since I've trained on them in a more serious fashion.
Round two.
Looks like I'm having a difficult time finding matches in terms of connection, though not necessarily pool of people. We'll see if I can manage to get something to chew on here.
one. Fight!
Pardon me. Lead now. Impact. This is true power. This is true power. This is true power. This is true power. Punch it. Oh my. Power to the earth. Light it up. I have the power of fire. It's always a pleasure. Of
Round two. Fight! G wins. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight!
Well, given that I'm having trouble finding any lounges with a good connection, I'll just wait here and lounge and see if anybody comes to me.
Final round. Fight!
power to the earth. Light it up. I have the power of fire.
Let's do this. Karin Kanzuki. Seth.
貴様の全てを見せてもらう。
Round 1. Fight.
邪魔だ。全てを見せろ。全てを見せろ。せい。甘い。
Round 2. Fight.
肩をつけてやる。終わりだ。
Final round. Fight.
肩をつけてやる。終わりだ。
You lose. Round 1. Fight.
全てを見せろ。邪魔だ。
Round 2. Fight.
気を出すと肩をつけてやる。終わりだ。
one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Final round. Fight! Sakura wins. Round one. Fight! Seth wins. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! 肩をつけてやる。終わりだ。Seth wins. It's go time. Let's do this. Arena 貴様の全てを見せてもらう。Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Final round. Fight! 本気を出すと肩をつけてやる。終わりだ。全てを見せる。 Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! You lose. Let's do this. Round one. Fight!
No place to go. I missed it. This is true power. Not my day.
Done.
Round two. Fight!
Don't shoot that. I missed it. You can run. No place to go. No place to go. You can run.
甘いね。どこに飛ぶ？
This is true power. This is true
G wins. Round one. Fight.
刻まってそれそれ甘い
Round two.
Alright, as it is coming up to about 9 p.m. US Eastern Time, and this lounge has gone for about the usual length of time on stream, we are going to be wrapping up shortly. So this will be the last on-stream match of the night, and after that, we will be signing off. Obviously, you can find our various group members a bit longer still. You could look for this lounge or any of the other regulars that you are aware of. But being a mix and mash week, this may not be as easy as usual, and there are no guarantees as to how long any particular player will be continuing. So, if you would like to join us for other games, we have our Thursdays Dead or Alive 6 60 Times Lounge, the same US Eastern 7 p.m. And if you keep an eye on our Twitter _MK_FGC, you might be informed if we have a Guilty Gear Tuesday train or anything like that tomorrow, or whether we have a disc guidance for the discussed Dhalsim bot if it's in finished shape on Friday. Otherwise, you can possibly expect that next Friday, or whenever it is that we do finalize it all. So if you'd like to find the original Dhalsim bot and have some idea of what's changed or such when you're watching that stream, you can find that and all of our other bots for this and other games at our website 2-mk.org. And just click on bots and you should find what you're looking for. So with that, we can sit back, watch the remainder of this match, and then I bid you all adieu.
Poison wins. Round one. Fight.
god.